Welcome, everybody. It's nice to have you here again for yet another talk of the third installment of the webinar Sciences of the Face series. Today, we are happy to host Eilidh NOYES. I hope I learned how to pronounce it almost correctly. I did my best, I promise. Eilidh is senior lecturer. Don't be fooled by her young age. She is already a top player in the field of face perception. She works in the University of Huddersfield, but she has completed her PhD, if I'm correct, at the University of York. And she also worked at Dallas at the Texas University with Alice O'Toole. And I let you share yours. You have 50 minutes, I'd say, and if you wish, I can tell you when we are 5 minutes from the end.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Is that all showing okay? Great. Thank you very much, Marco, for the introduction and for inviting me to present to you all today. My name, as Marco said, is Eilidh NOYES, and I work at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom. My research is on human and machine face recognition, and I often do work looking at face recognition in really very challenging image scenarios. Today, I'm going to talk about super recognizers, forensic face examiners, and computer algorithms in face recognition. I'll start with a bit of an overview on face recognition performance for typical observers, and then move on to super recognizers, who are people who are really very good at identifying faces. I'll then talk about some recent work that we've conducted looking at face masks and the performance of typical observers and super recognizers, and then move on to look at forensic examiners and computer algorithms and discuss how we can achieve the very best of face recognition for adult faces. To start with, I just wanted to demonstrate how important face identification is and the consequences that can happen when face identification goes wrong. On the 22nd of July 2005, John Charles Dominese was shot by police in a case of mistaken identity. There were many factors that contributed to this shooting, but one was erroneous face matching. The police were given an image of Hussein Osman, the man on the left in the picture here, and mistook John Charles Dominese for being this man. When face identification goes wrong, really serious consequences can occur. You may be familiar with the Innocence Project. This is a project in the USA where they investigate alleged wrongful convictions. So people that have been put into prison for crimes which they say they did not commit. There is now DNA evidence available in some of these cases which couldn't be analysed at the time of the original arrests. We've since had advances in technology which makes it possible to look at this additional evidence. 367 people have been found to be innocent based on DNA evidence to date. Those people had served 14 years in prison on average already. Out of those people who were found to be innocent, 69% of original arrests involved eyewitness misidentification. So we tend to take face identifications, we tend to think that they will be accurate. So what happens when we recognize a face? What do we mean by face recognition? Face recognition involves comparing an image of a face that we see in front of us to a representation which we have stored in our memory. If the two are sufficiently similar, then recognition occurs. We think we've seen that face before. And if it's not similar enough, then recognition doesn't occur. We don't think we've seen the face before. So there's a memory component involved in this task. And for a long time, people thought if we could just fix that memory aspect, make people better at remembering the faces, then all of these problems with face identification would be over. But more recently, a different type of identification problem has also become important, and that's the task of face matching. So in face matching, you have multiple images of a face in front of you, which you're to compare. So we've removed the memory component. The images are there that you can look back and forth between. This is the task, for example, that passport officers would need to do. They'd be looking at an image on a passport and the person in front of them and trying to work out if the person's the same or not. So we're going to have a look now to see how difficult or how easy this task might be. So I've got an image pair on the screen here. I'd like you to think, is this the same person or a different identity? So hopefully it's easy for you to work out that that is the same identity. But that's not really face matching at all, because that's the exact same image twice. That's not the task that a passport officer would have to do. A passport officer's photos that they're comparing might be taken many, many years apart. Unfamiliar image matching is a really easy task. We're very good at comparing exact images of a face. This task is more realistic of the applied scenario. So as you guys are on the web call here, it's harder to see what your responses are, but I can just, hopefully if you imagine, if you answer this, if this is the same or different identity. How about this one? Yeah. So I'm judging this on Marco. So he's got this one correct. This one's the same identity and this one's a different identity. These images were taken, these ones here were taken immediately after each other, just with different cameras. So there's really very little variation between the photos, and yet it's still not an immediately obvious task. People make errors about 20 to 30% of the time on face identification tasks, whether that be images where you're doing a paired matching scenario, so just comparing two images side by side, looking at a lineup array, or comparing a live person to an image on an identification card. Unfamiliar face matching is typically highly error prone. But have a look at this one here. Do you know who that is? Yeah, Mark looks like he knows who that is. I'm assuming you all will as well. So it should be quite easy to work out that this is Obama in this image. But if we actually look at the image itself, you can't really see the features in much detail at all. You can hardly work out where the eyes and the nose and the mouth are on the image, let alone things like eye color or the edges of the features. So here's Obama in a full quality image there. But even though that image before was poor quality, we could recognize the face was Obama. This is important to realize that familiar face recognition is extremely accurate. We can recognize people we know well, our friends, our family, celebrities, with extremely high accuracy. Often people think that because we are so good at familiar face recognition, they assume we'll be good at recognizing all faces, which is not the case. Familiar face recognition is something that humans are extremely good at. Unfamiliar face recognition is much more error prone. But why is the task so difficult? Well, I saw that Gobini had used this in her lecture a few weeks ago, so you'll probably all know the answers by now. If you didn't see that, you can think how many images are in that array. Most people, when they look at the images, think there's maybe 4, 5, 6 different identities here, but actually there's only 2. But if we replace these images with images of celebrities that we know, it's much easier to work out that there's just 2 identities in the array. So what we think is happening with it when we're becoming familiar with a face is that we're learning the different ways that a face can vary. So for familiar face recognition, you've learnt that variability. For an unfamiliar face, you don't really know how that face will vary because you only have very limited exposure and experience with that face. So as a brief overview of what we've seen so far, image matching is a really easy task regardless of if the faces are unfamiliar or if they're familiar. Face matching is quite a difficult task if the faces are unknown to us, but usually we are quite good at it if the faces are familiar. There are factors which can impair unfamiliar face recognition further. Factors can be human factors or image factors. So people are poorer at recognizing faces if they're fatigued or if they're bored, and people are also subject to the other race effect. This means that people are typically better at recognizing faces of their own race than faces of other races. There are also factors that relate to the image themselves, which affect our ability to recognize the people in the image. So the bigger the difference between the images that we're comparing, the harder it usually is to make the identification. So for example, if the images vary in viewpoint, pose, lighting, expression, age, or quality, it can be hard to work out if the images are the same or different identity. There are also issues with changes in camera to subject distance, deliberate disguise, and hyper-realistic masks. And I'm going to show you some examples of that from our research. So this example here shows the effect on camera to subject distance on same and different identities. So if you look at that top left quadrant here, hopefully you can see my mouse. This image here is an image of the same identity with photographs taken several weeks apart. But the images were taken at the same camera subject distance. Below, we also have the same person, but this time his photo is taken at 2 different distances. And there's only about 1.5 meters difference between the camera and the subject here, between the 2 photographs. But it really drastically changes a person's appearance. And you can see the same on different identity trials. This here is different identities. They look a bit more similar when the images are taken at the same camera distance. Here they look a bit more different when they're taken at different distances. The effect that you find for different identities will kind of depend on what the face naturally looks like and if it looks more similar or more different at these different distances. But what's important to note here is just this really simple change of being further or closer to the camera affects how a face can look. We've also conducted research on deliberate disguise. So all of that research that I talked to you about at the start, where we saw that performance was quite poor for faces, was based on situations where people were cooperating with the effort to identify themselves. In real-world situations, people might have really quite strong incentives to change their appearance to look unlike themselves or like somebody else. So I have some images here from our disguise face database. So these were colleagues of mine at the time who were excellent and took part in this research and became very competitive to have the very best disguises. But you can see here that this is the same person, but she looks very different across different disguises. So this is her naturally, and this is her trying to look unlike herself. These are now different people, with this girl trying to look like this person. This is the same person right in the middle there, but in 2 different disguises. And then this is her looking like this girl. And then, oh, that one. This is the same girl here, but she is disguised to look unlike herself. So deliberate disguise can impair face matching accuracy. Unfamiliar viewers are drastically impaired by disguise, and familiar viewers are slightly impaired by disguise. So familiar viewers are impaired by evasion disguise. So this kind of situation, like on the 2 edges, when the same person looks different, but familiar people are able to see through impersonation disguise. So when someone's trying to look like somebody else. We've also done work with computer algorithms and disguise, and some algorithms are very impaired by disguises. That will vary depending on the algorithm. We've also conducted research on hyper-realistic masks. This is the kind of masks you might see in some kind of movie situations. But again, it can be a challenge to actually identify that somebody is wearing a mask and then to try and identify somebody in a mask compared to a photo of them not in a mask. So there's multiple situations that can make the unfamiliar face recognition even harder than it is in those cooperative scenarios that we talked about at the start. So far I've talked about performance of typical observers. There are some people who are much better than typical observers at face identification, and they are called super recognizers. So most people perform in the middle here. Most people perform with that kind of 20 to 30% errors on face identification tasks. But we think that face recognition ability falls along a normal distribution. So some people with prosopagnosia, are extremely poor at identifying faces. Others, super recognizers, are extremely good at the task. Super recognizers are people who perform with around 2 standard deviations above the mean on tasks of face identification. And the term was only coined quite recently, in about 2009, where people realized that there's the opposite of prosopagnosia exists. There are some people out there who are exceptionally good at recognizing faces. And I've got some quotes here from super recognizers to help us understand some insight into their ability. One says, "I've learned to stop surprising people with bizarre comments like, 'Hey, weren't you at that so-and-so concert last fall? I recognize you.' Before that, I'd occasionally make people uncomfortable with my recognition." Another says, "I do have to pretend that I don't remember people, however, because it seems like I stalk them or that they mean more to me than they did when I recall that we saw each other once walking on campus 4 years ago in front of the quad." So you could imagine that actually having superior face recognition ability could have quite a big impact on your day-to-day life if you're able to recognize people that you've had only very brief encounters with and then remember their face over time. So there's been quite a bit of research on super recognizers just in the last few years. And what this research consistently shows is that groups of super recognizers consistently outperform comparison groups, so controls, at face recognition and face perception tasks. So this is true for tasks of face memory, face matching, and even tasks like trying to pick out a face in a crowd. So there's this group level advantage for super recognizers. What makes these super recognizers super at the task? Well, that's a more complicated question. It's possible that the ability might be hereditary. There's lots of work going on to try and work out if super recognizers are doing something fundamentally different to other people. But so far, there's not compelling evidence that this is the case. Some work has found some advantages for certain super recognizers, so not all super recognizers. Some have found that super recognizers look more at the nose, for example, or show a bigger inversion effect for faces. But it's still a bit of a mystery about why super recognizers are superior. We can talk more about super recognizers in the discussion if that's something anyone's interested in. But I'm going to move on now to a recent study that we conducted about face matching. And we do look at super recognizer performance and performance of typical observers for faces in masks or sunglasses. Face masks are a new challenge for the Western world when it comes to face identification. There's been titles such as this one, "We're headed for a faceless future as masks become the norm." That's a big security concern. It's understandable why now the world is interested in humans' ability and machines' ability to recognize faces in face masks. Face masks occlude the lower portion of the face. So this is something that many of us weren't really used to seeing prior to the pandemic. We didn't usually see faces in face masks. But what we were used to seeing were faces in sunglasses. You're probably more used to that than I am in the UK, as you have better weather. But faces in sunglasses occlude that higher region, the eye region of the face. So we wanted to know, what effect do face masks have on identification? And how does that compare to an occlusion that we're already used to? Are face masks more detrimental to face matching than sunglasses, or vice versa? So the work here that I'm presenting is based on a paper that we submitted to Royal Society, and it's in collaboration with Professor Josh Davis, Nicola Petrov, Dr. Katie Gray, and Dr. Kay Ritchie. A bit of background theory here. So lots of research on face identification has said that the eye region of the face is particularly important in identifications. You talked about this a little bit in Ben's talk when he talked about changing the eyes, and you may be now used to this idea of sort of if you use contrast negation on a face on the eye region, that's particularly problematic for recognizing a face compared to other areas. Some research on super recognizers has shown that maybe the nose region is most important. Some super recognizers seem to fixate more on the nose than other parts of the face. Or it could be that for unfamiliar faces, we're just comparing all the available information that's there. So if that's the case, a mask would cover up more of the face than the sunglasses, just takes up more space of the face. It covers the nose and mouth, whereas the sunglasses just cover the eyes. So that would suggest that maybe the mask situation would be more problematic for face recognition. So we have 3 questions that we were exploring within this study. We looked at face matching performance for typical observers and super recognizers for familiar faces and unfamiliar faces. And we also looked at performance on an emotion recognition task. Our participant group was the same for all 3 studies. And we had 102 super recognizers. These are people who had scored with very high accuracy on screening tests for superior face recognition. And we had 102 what we called non-practice controls. These are people who hadn't done face recognition tasks before, so we have no insight into their face recognition ability. And we had 102 practice controls. These are people who had done face recognition tasks before, and we know that they didn't qualify as being super recognizers. So experiment 1 was a familiar face matching task. Participants saw pairs of face images, and they had to decide if the images were the same or different identities. The image on the left was always an unconcealed face. The image on the right was either also unconcealed, in sunglasses, or in a face mask. The participants saw 12 trials in the familiar face matching task. This is quite a small number, but we conducted this research quite early on in the pandemic at a time where people had to stay at home. So there weren't pictures of celebrities in face masks. So we kind of had to rely on any images of celebrities. They needed to be really famous celebrities. So the few celebrities that we could find in face masks. So they saw each celebrity only once, and they saw both same and different identity trials. But again, only would have seen that celebrity in either a same or a different identity trial. So here we have performance on the familiar face matching task. On the x-axis, we have the concealment condition. And we have accuracy here on the y-axis. And we have the different participant groups in different colors. So in this study, we found that super recognizers outperformed controls. There was no difference in performance between our practice controls and our non-practice controls. And unfamiliar participants were worse at recognizing faces in masks than faces that were unconcealed. But there was no difference in their performance to matching sunglasses and masks. So they were just as poor at recognizing faces in a mask as they were at recognizing a face in sunglasses. We also ran an experiment which involved unfamiliar faces. So it was very similar design, well, exact same design, we just had more images. We had 60 images this time. And again, you just see unconcealed faces, one face in sunglasses or one in a mask, and you're just to decide if the images are the same or different identities. Here again, we find a main effect of participant group. So the super recognizers outperformed the control participants. Performance was lowest for mask faces for the control participants, followed by their performance for sunglasses, and then they were best for unconcealed faces. So we got this kind of stepwise detriment. So it was unconcealed face matching was best, then sunglasses, then masks. Super recognizers, though, were equally accurate at recognizing faces in sunglasses or faces in masks. So it's also worth noting the kind of amount of performance reduction which is going on here. So performance for unconcealed faces, if we look at the non-practice control group, it's about 80%. It drops down there to about 75% for faces in a mask. So it is reducing performance, but not massively compared to some other work. For example, when we did that disguise study and we looked at faces that were which were in evasion disguise dropped performance right down to chance. So we saw performance detriments of like 45%. So masks are reducing performance, but not quite as much as some face identification task can do. If people did make an error, their bias was to respond different identity for masked faces. So they think people in masks the masked photo and the unconcealed photo are more likely to look different. They don't have enough information there to say they look like the same identity. We also ran an emotion recognition task, looking at Ekman's 7 basic emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, neutral, faces, sadness, and surprise. So for this study, we used superimposed images of masks. For emotion databases, they had to go through a validation process, and we didn't have the resources over COVID pandemic to create a new database with real masks. So we superimposed images onto a database which was already validated. So people would see an image like this on the screen, and it would flash up for 1,000 milliseconds, and then they were asked to respond with which emotion they saw. So that answer was anger for that face there. So each face was on the screen for 1,000 milliseconds, and you just respond to what emotion you think the face is. Images were presented as with no concealment, sunglasses, or with a mask, and again, you don't see repeat identities. So the results here are slightly complicated, but also somewhat how you would expect the results to be in certain situations. So we'll focus now on this top graph, which is performance for non-practice participants, because performance is quite similar across our three groups. For happiness, we do see a reduction in performance for masked faces, much more than the reduction for masked or unconcealed faces. However, some emotions are equally impaired or impaired both by sunglasses and masks. For example, if we look at sadness there, sunglasses actually have reduced performance slightly more, but not significantly more so than masks. And it seemed to depend on where the action units were in the face for expressing that emotion. So if the action units were largely in the mouth region, then covering the mouth reduced performance for that emotion. If action units were largely in the upper regions, then those areas were important. Those areas, if they were covered, resulted in lower performance. But there are some interesting theoretical points in here. For example, surprise and anger. We see that if we look at surprise, for example, there's a reduction in performance for the surprise when someone's in a mask. But a lot of the theory says that we should be seeing more of a reduction for sunglasses. It's like this eye region of the face is again more important for surprise in some studies, but that could be linked to the eyebrows. But there's something to think about there, but it does show that that mouth region is contributing somewhat to the surprise emotion. So we saw that masks reduced categorization accuracy for disgust, happiness, and surprise, and categorization of anger and fear were reduced by both masks and by sunglasses. So in this study, the key findings were that masks impaired performance, but not sunglasses when the face were familiar. For unfamiliar faces, we get that stepwise reduction where it was unconcealed faces were worst, followed by sunglasses, followed by masks. We get an overall advantage for super recognizers, but I haven't shown you this in the results here, but in the paper we did individual analysis. We did correlations and plotted performance of the individual super recognizers, and we found variation in performance at the individual level. And that's something which is quite typical in super recognizer research. Although the super recognizers as a group perform really well, you always get some super recognizers who haven't performed as well as you would expect them to do as a super recognizer. And in terms of the emotion, it kind of depended on the emotion that we looked at. So I'd mentioned there that we saw less of a reduction in performance for occlusion of features than we did in the past when we looked at disguise and alterations. I think what that shows us there is that with disguise, you're altering the information in the face. So the information is there, but it's unhelpful. You're providing erroneous information about how that person looks. Where at least in occlusion, you're just covering up the information. So you're not putting in wrong information, you're just reducing the information that is there. And in doing that, that seems to be a bit less detrimental than actually changing the appearance of the face. In real world interactions, you get additional cues. You get cues from the body, the voice, and the gait. All of those things might make it even easier to recognize someone in a mask in real life situations. So I've talked about super recognizers now and typical observers, but in forensic situations, images can be compared by forensic facial examiners. Forensic facial examiners are professionally trained to identify faces. They use tools and procedures and can take a really long time, with several days, to make a single identification. Their identification decisions in the UK can be used to support legal actions, prosecution, and can provide expert testimony in court. So we're going to come back to test facial examiner performance in a bit, but I wanted to explain what they are now so you know everyone that we're going to compare. Face identification can also be performed by face recognition algorithms. Many of you are familiar now with face recognition algorithms in your everyday life. You might even have face recognition algorithms on your phone to unlock your phone, or you might use your face to unlock your banking password, your banking accounts, and all sorts of things now. All sorts of applications are using a face in place of a password. Or at border security, you might have gone through electronic e-gates. Face recognition algorithms can be used to assist humans in forensic practice with their face identifications. They can be used for one-to-one image matching scenarios, so that's when you have two images of a face and you ask the algorithm to compare how similar the images are. Or you can input an image into an algorithm and ask the algorithm to return a candidate list, so a list of people who are most similar in appearance to the image that you've input. And those are the images that the algorithm has on a database. But what are these face recognition algorithms actually doing? So I don't know if anyone here works in face recognition algorithms. I'm going to give quite a high-level overview, but hopefully this will be useful for anyone who's not so familiar with what face recognition algorithms are doing. So what happens when you use your face recognition algorithm? Well, you need to input your image into the algorithm. The algorithm then searches the image for the presence of features. So a feature is just anything that the algorithm deems important in an identification. So the algorithm scans the image for the presence of these features and then provides a numerical representation to tell you the feature scores for each feature it's looking for within the image. So if we take this image on the left here, the unmasked image, imagine that's in the algorithm. So it's scanning the image and then it's given it a feature vector score of 5 for the first feature, and then 3 for the next feature, 1 for the next feature, and so on. So it's this numerical representation which tells you how much of each feature is found within the image. So I've oversimplified things here because in reality you usually have over 500 features it's searching for, and the feature score is usually between 0 and 1. But I've just used a scale of 1 to 5 here because it's still the same idea. It can either be a high score on a feature or a low score on a feature. And then when your second image is scanned by the algorithm, it's again looking for the presence of features within that image, it's looking for the same features, and then you get a feature vector score for the presence of those features within that image. So then you can compare feature vector for image 1 with feature vector for image 2. And this is usually done through distance metric learning. And this is where people get confused with what algorithms are doing. Because when people say distance metric learning, they think that algorithms are looking at the distances between features in the face. You have seen from that example I showed you before, that would be a really bad thing for algorithms to be doing, as the distances between features of the face can vary depending on how far the image how far the camera is from the image. So that's very unlikely to be what the algorithm's actually doing at all. The distance metric learning is about comparing the distance between feature vector 1 and feature vector 2. So it's how close are these numbers to each other? How similar is feature vector 1 to feature vector 2? If the vectors are very similar to each other, then this suggests the images are the same identity. If the vectors are very different, then this suggests the images are of different identities. But before any of that feature comparison can take place, and before it can even look at the image and scan it for the presence of features, the algorithm needs to detect the face in the image. So if the image is too poor quality, for example, face detection will not occur. So the algorithm needs to detect the face and then it can scan it for the presence of features and make a similarity comparison. There's two main types of face recognition algorithms. There's early algorithms and newer deep convolutional neural networks. Early face recognition algorithms rely on a human programmer to tell them which features to look for in an image. Whereas deep convolutional neural networks, which have been used since around 2014 onwards for face recognition, they are trained on huge quantities of labeled data. So they learn for themselves which features in an image are most informative for identification. And it's probably not something we can even put a word on, like the eyes, nose, or mouth. It could be specific lines in the image or sort of curvatures. But the algorithm is finding that out itself through this training process. There's also multiple computational layers, which means the algorithm is searching the image many, many times, which helps the algorithm become better at recognizing people across changes in pose, for example, as it's less reliant on the exact location of a feature staying constant in an image. Older algorithms are pretty good, providing that the image is front-facing and good quality. They became a lot better from the early 90s to the early 2000s, but that was kind of as good as they got. This front-facing, good quality images they can do, but as soon as the image changes in pose, illumination, expression, accuracy is much lower. Deep convolutional neural networks, on the other hand, they can be very accurate for front-facing images, and they can also handle more image variation. Some of the state-of-the-art algorithms are now far outperforming humans on really challenging image tasks. They typically rely on quite good image quality. There are still some issues with DCNNs, including race bias, and again, happy to discuss DCNNs in more detail in the discussion afterwards if anyone's interested in those. So we've talked now about super recognizers, forensic facial examiners, and computer algorithms. And the reason that I introduced all of them there is because these are the different methods where people or machines are most likely to be accurate at identifying faces. But what is best? What should we be using in practice? What's most accurate? In 2017, we published a study which put super recognizers, forensic facial examiners, and computer algorithms head-to-head for the first time. This paper is published in the journal PNAS, and it was published in 2017. So in this experiment, we had three groups of participants. We had forensic examiners, and we had 57 forensic examiners take part, and they worked across 5 different continents. These examiners used their tools and procedures because we wanted to know what their performance was like in situations which mimicked operational practice, because that's then a fair test of what it would be like in practice. We had 13 super recognizers, so these were people who performed very well on standard tests of face recognition ability or on the job success. They'd had lots of on-the-job success at identifying people. But what's important to recognize the difference between forensic examiners and super recognizers is for super recognizers, it seems to be this sort of natural ability, and they've not received professional training on how to recognize faces. Whereas forensic examiners, they have received training and they use specific tools and procedures to do their identifications. Super recognizers also do identifications very quickly, whereas forensic examiners need more time to carry out their procedures. We also tested 4 face identification algorithms. And the task was again a face matching task. People saw pairs of images and they had to just decide same or different identity, but this time they actually used a rating scale. They had 20 images in total. We couldn't use many more than that because it's very time demanding for the forensic examiners. They take days for identification and they're obviously doing really important work as well. So this takes up a lot of their time. So we had 20 image pairs, and these images were really carefully selected to be challenging. This was done by using computer algorithms, which weren't used in the current study, so it's not cheating the algorithm there, but different algorithms, and also using humans to try and work out what images would be challenging. The examiners had up to 3 months to make their identifications, and as I said before, they had access to their tools. So here's an example of the types of images that they saw. And they're meant to be quite challenging images, but at the same time, they're challenging, but the quality is still quite good. You know, they're better than you could get from some CCTV cameras. And here are the results that we found for this experiment. I'm going to break this down. So we've got lots of different participants groups here. So we're going to focus in on examiners, super recognizers, students, we'll use that as our main control group, and algorithms. And then we've got accuracy as AUC score on the x-axis here. Easiest way to think of AUC score without going into the details now, you could think, so 1 is perfect performance, 0.5 is chance, you can kind of think of it a bit like 100% accuracy versus 50% accuracy. So examiners, we've got the median performance in red here. Examiners performed with equal accuracy. There was no difference between performance of examiners and super recognizers. Sorry. So super recognizers and examiners, there was no statistical difference in performance between the two. Both were statistically better than students. Much better than student performance, which was down here. So both the examiners and the super recognizers are doing well at the task. So important to note though, that we're seeing the spread of performance again for super recognizers. Some are doing really well, as you would kind of expect a super recognizer to do, but this person down here, they've really not performed at the levels you would maybe expect a super recognizer to do based on their performance on previous tasks. You also see a spread of performance in examiners as well. So while more are clustered towards the top, there are some examiners with lower accuracy. And then we have algorithm performance on the far right of the graph here. So we tested algorithms in 2015 up to 2017. So this was the latest algorithm that we had access to at the time. And you can see how the algorithm has improved across time. That was to 2017, which is now a few years ago. So the 2017 algorithm that we had access to was performing with accuracy rates that were equivalent to that of our forensic examiners. But the take-home message of our study was not to use one or the other, man or machine, but actually the very highest accuracy was achieved by combining the scores through fusion, so at the item level, of the top performing humans and algorithms. So there may be a role for humans and algorithms to work together to solve the face identification problems. This suggests that humans and algorithms are approaching identifications in a slightly different way, so then you get that benefit of both by combining the identification decisions. So the next steps for us in this part of the journey for now is to test performance of examiners and algorithms for faces in masks. And this is some work that we're currently conducting and I can talk to you about in the discussion. Feel free to get in touch with any questions. I'd love to speak to you all about your work as well and hear your suggestions. But thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to discussing everything that you've heard. Thank you.